Samantha's patience with Samuel has worn thin, and she firmly rejects his proposal to live together. However, Samuel's angry reaction and his new demand for Samantha to quit her job and move in with him complicate matters. How will Samantha handle this sudden display of control? Can she assert her independence? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 7 today. Almost a week had passed, and Samuel still hadn't left my side. We'd fallen into a routine, and it wasn't one I cared for. I'd wake up in the morning and he would be there, already dressed for the day. I'd get ready and he'd walk me to work. When I got off, he'd walk me to the store. Even though I begged, he wouldn't let me go anywhere else. When the day was over, he'd return home with me and sleep on my floor as a wolf. It was highly monotonous. The first few days my emotions were mixed with anger, fear, and annoyance. But when I realized he wasn't leaving or hurting me, I forced myself to get used to it. I hardly noticed him anymore. He still tried to speak to me, tried to learn about my life, but I wouldn't divulge the information. He didn't deserve it. The more I thought about it, the more I knew I couldn't handle this routine much longer. It would drive me insane. I never was one for routine in the first place. Plus, I knew that Samuel would soon want more. More than walking me places. More than sleeping on a blanket. More than being tolerated and ignored. I also knew that when that happened, I didn't have a chance. Wolves took what they wanted without repercussion. But I had today. Today was the day I was getting out of here. I'd been thinking and rethinking my new plan since I met Samuel, and I finally had it figured out. It was foolproof. Are you ready, Samantha? Samuel's voice suddenly met my ears. It was quiet, almost less than a whisper. I was in the bathroom finishing getting ready for the day. Though I didn't like the idea of having Samuel in my room, I couldn't complain too much. He'd kept his end of the bargain, so I had to keep mine. In order for me to let Samuel stick to my side like a lost puppy, he had to keep quiet and out of sight. I didn't want anyone knowing about him. I knew that if James found out there was another werewolf in our lives, my brother wouldn't be the only one living in a hospital. Just about. I breathed in the direction of the door. He was quiet, waiting patiently for me. I stared at myself in the mirror for a moment longer, preparing for the day ahead. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. When I left the bathroom, I didn't bother glancing at Samuel. I walked straight to my closet and pulled out the large sack of supplies, slipping my usual backpack inside. It was difficult to drag out of the closet, especially with my good hand still in a sling, so I wasn't surprised when Samuel came and took it from my grasp. "What's this for?" he asked. I snuck a peek at his face, trying to read his thoughts. His expression usually told all. At the moment, though, his features were blank and confused. "I have to pay the hospital today." He narrowed his eyes and I quickly continued. I knew he'd object, so I had an argument prepared. "I know the deal was that I don't go anywhere but work and home, but I don't have a choice today." "Well, needs this?" "I don't have a choice." We were now in the middle of my room. I went to grab the sack from Samuel, but he lifted it over his shoulder. Without another look my way, he headed for the window. I watched, a little surprised, as he closed it behind him. I hadn't expected to win this easily. Shaking my head, I slipped on my shoes and walked out of my bedroom. James had left not too long ago, so it was only my mother sitting in the kitchen next to our front door. I smiled at her, dodging the variously broken tiles leading to the kitchen table. I sat down for a moment, though I knew Samuel was waiting. This was the only chance I had to say goodbye. My mother took my hands in her own, watching my face. I avoided her gaze, suddenly feeling guilty. I wanted to tell her everything, but I knew I couldn't. If she had information she was withholding from James, or any werewolf for that matter, she'd be done for. This way was better. Safer. Instead of voicing my innermost thoughts, I studied the rundown kitchen for a moment. The yellow wallpaper had faded and was now stained brown. The cabinets lining the walls matched the color, and the wood was splintering in every crevice. The stove and refrigerator barely worked, and the gray tile had too many pieces missing. Even though this place was barely livable, I would miss it. This was home. My mom noticed my gaze and followed it. "I wish we could fix this place up." I looked back at her and smiled. "Me too. Maybe someday." Silence fell once again, and I knew I was running out of time. I'd figured once this moment had come I'd know what to say. But here I was struggling to find the right words. "Mom," I began. "What's wrong, honey?" I smiled. "I just wanted to tell you I love you." I hesitated, trying to find a way to let her know I wouldn't be coming home tonight. Or ever again. "I'm going to be working pretty late tonight, so I don't think I'll see you." I trained my eyes on hers, hoping she would catch on. Her expression was calm until she met my intense stare. She was startled for a minute before she brought her brow together and frowned. I glanced at the door, watching for figures outside its window. I could tell she wanted me to elaborate, but I held a finger to my lips and shook my head. "I have to go, but I love you." I stood up and she followed suit. We embraced each other and I held her tightly, probably tighter than I ever had before. I didn't want to leave my mother alone, but I knew neither of us stood a chance if I stayed. If I left, I could come back and save her too. When I pulled away, I could tell she understood. Maybe not the entire situation, but enough to know I wasn't coming home. Her eyes were slightly wet, and her hand was cupping her jaw. She nodded slowly, meeting my gaze. Before I could start to cry, I turned away. "Bye, Mom. Love you." I opened the front door and jumped down the steps, practically running away. I knew the farther away I was, the easier it would be. Without waiting for Samuel, I started walking down the sidewalk. I knew he would follow suit. Soon enough, I heard his footsteps coming from behind. By the time he reached me, I had my composure once again. "You're working late." I knew he'd been listening. "Yeah, I forgot to tell you yesterday. That, and we've got to drop off the bag at the hospital." "What if I dropped it off?" I shot him a wary look. "That's not part of the deal. The hospital probably knows who you are, and will obviously ask questions." "Well, going to the hospital isn't part of our deal either." I started to interject, but he continued over me. "But since I'm so nice, I'm allowing it." He smiled at the end, flashing his teeth. I scoffed. He was allowing it. Silence followed us for a few minutes after that. Samuel held my sack and I led the way to my work. He knew the way by now, but I took a different backstreet every time. I didn't want anyone I knew seeing me with him. "I was thinking we could have lunch today," Samuel spoke, almost unsure of himself. "I have a few hours I can get away." Panic struck. This couldn't happen. Not today. He noticed me tense and gave me a questioning glance. I tried to relax as I carefully responded. "I really can't today. My boss has me working in the kitchen." I smiled inwardly. That wasn't a lie, so I could get away with it. "He won't let you off for an hour." I sighed. I didn't have to lie about this one either. Any hour not worked is an hour without pay. I can't afford that, especially now. He nodded, though somewhat reluctantly. "Okay. Another time then." "Sure," I said without thinking. We'd almost made it to my work by now. I stopped, turning towards Samuel for what I hoped to be the last time. I gestured for my bag, which he slid off his shoulder and placed on my own. I steadied it and started to turn from him. Before I could take a step, though, he grabbed my waist. I stopped dead, my eyes traveling down to his fingers. They weren't malicious or demanding but rested gently against my shirt. I still tried to pull away, but his grasp was firm. My heart started beating faster. All my senses now on high alert. "What are you doing?" I asked in between struggles. As if for an answer, he took the bag off my shoulder and dropped it to the ground before wrapping his other arm around my waist. He pulled me in close to his chest and held me there, sighing. I, on the other hand, was close to having a panic attack. He hadn't tried to touch me before, so I wasn't sure why today was so special. Did he know something? "Please stop squirming, I just want a hug. You hugged your mother, so I should get one as well." His voice was playful, almost whining. I stopped moving and let my hands fall to my sides. I trusted him enough to know he wouldn't hurt me, and I'd learned earlier this week that fighting his grasp was hopeless. All I could do was wait it out. "See, that wasn't so bad," Samuel smiled as he pulled away. It was crooked and didn't show his teeth, so I knew there was more. "What else do you want?" I asked suspiciously. "How do you know I want something else?" "Because I'm not an idiot. You know, my parents always told me I wore what I was thinking. I guess they were right." He laughed slightly. I rolled my eyes. "I really don't have time for this. Can I go now?" "No, I do have something else. Question, actually. Can it not wait?" I glanced down the street. I really was going to be late if he didn't let me go. Any minute spent here was a minute taken away from my plan. Samuel huffed. No, it can't. I need you to think about it, so I wanted to tell you before I saw you again tonight. I stared at him, waiting for the question. Well, his voice softened. I really want to spend more time with you. I want to get to know you more. But I know you have to work and you have to be at home. I understand that. So he paused to take in my expression. I narrowed my eyes, knowing where this was going. What if you moved in with me? I choked on my spit. I guess I didn't know where he was going. Hear me out, Samuel started. I quickly interrupted him. No. No way. Absolutely not. I don't even know you. That's the problem. How else are we going to get to know each other? Listen, if you move in, then that fixes everything. You could still go to work, but instead of going to your stepdad's house, you just come to my place. You'd be safer, I'd see you more, and we would both be happy. He smirked a little bit before finishing. Plus, I could actually sleep in a bed. I scowled at him. A full-on, holding nothing back. I hate you scowl. My eyes were shooting daggers and I'm pretty sure steam was coming out of my ears. My good hand balled into a fist and I suddenly wanted to swing it at his face. I knew my sudden buildup of rage was coming from a week of annoyance, but I didn't care. His question threw me off the edge of a cliff and I wasn't climbing back up. If you don't want to sleep on the floor, then you should leave. I don't want you there anyway, I spat. His eyes widened and he faltered. Pain shot across his features. However, I continued. I'm not leaving my mom. I'm not leaving my job. And I am not moving in with you. I don't want you. I didn't know why I was telling him these things, considering I'd be gone by tonight. Maybe I had no filter. Maybe I didn't want him thinking I cared for him. Maybe I was just stupid. But despite my brain telling me to calm down, I continued to scowl. I couldn't stand him. I didn't care that he was angry or hurt. I cared about leaving this godforsaken place and finding a way to survive. He'd only made things more difficult for me. Samuel growled and I whipped my gaze to his. You know what? You're fucking impossible. I scoffed, though I noticed the dangerous change in tone. I'm impossible. You're a deranged lunatic who thinks I'm going to magically fall in love with a dog. Mistake number one. His eyes started turning shades, lightening to ruby by the second. I involuntarily stepped back, watching as his chest rose and fell erratically. You're done. What? Those weren't the words I'd expected to come out of his mouth. You're done. I'm done. I've let you have your way for the past week in hopes that you'd drop your fucking attitude and act like an adult. I thought if I was nice enough and let you continue doing whatever the hell it is you do, you'd realize I'm not the enemy here. I guess I overestimated you. Words wouldn't come to my mouth. I stared at him, suddenly terrified that I'd just ruined everything with a lost temper. He continued on. You're quitting your damn job. Today. After that, you're moving in with me. I don't care about what you want because you know what? You don't know even what you want. You're just a fucking human. You don't even have enough goddamn sense to give a werewolf respect. By the time he was finished, his breathing was labored. I could tell he was hanging on by a thread. I bent my head, trying not to make the same mistake twice. I should have let this whole thing go. But he'd thrown me off guard and I reacted before I thought it through. Now everything was at stake. Sorry. It took everything I had to utter those 2 syllables. I gritted my teeth and bit my tongue, trying not to let his insults stick. I wanted nothing more than to scream at him and let him know what I really thought about his acts of kindness. But if I was going to have a chance at leaving today, I had to fix this. The way things were headed, Samuel wouldn't let me leave his side again. Samuel growled again. No, you're not. Don't lie to me. I stayed quiet. Anything I said was going to add gasoline to his fire. Tell them you're quitting and it's your last day. I'm picking you up at 6. If you're not outside, then you better pray to your God there's no one around for me to kill. I flinched as he spun on his heels and started walking the opposite direction, watching until he disappeared. My heart was pounding in my ears, making it impossible to tell when he was truly gone. Tears stung at my eyes, but I didn't let them flow. Instead, I ignored what had just happened and finished the half-block to work. If I had any hesitations about leaving, they were gone now. I walked into my restaurant determined. It was time to finish this. Chapter 8 Goodbyes Part 1. I opened the wooden door and a bell rang above my head, signaling my entrance. My head was still pounding from the encounter with Samuel, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. I wouldn't make any more mistakes. Quickly looking around, I noticed there weren't too many people inside the restaurant today. I sighed. At least something was on my side. I quickly darted to the edge of the room, avoiding the circular tables that were normally filled with varying cheap meals. I dropped my sack in a corner next to the checkout counter, praying no one would get curious. Once I reached the back room, I quickly clocked in and headed to the washing station. I greeted my coworkers as I walked by, though there were only a few of us. My head was bent low and I began to cough. It was small and I pretended I was trying to hide it. Of course, people still took notice. They shot me glances varying from worried to annoyed. I paid them no mind though, and finished the short walk to my station. I prayed I would see my boss on the way over so I wouldn't have to work for too long. Sure enough, as I was opening the door to the back room, a tall, old and lanky man appeared in my vision. I looked up to meet his face, noting his look of concern. I smiled to myself. He was one of the good ones. "Samantha, what are you doing?" His voice was a surprisingly low tone, but I was used to it by now. "Going to wash dishes." His wrinkled features became more defined as he frowned. "I heard that you were coughing. Now that I'm seeing you, you don't look very chipper." His mustache followed his words, angling down at the end of the sentence. I sighed. Maybe fighting with Samuel had been an advantage. I didn't have to fake being shaken up. "Word travels fast here," I smiled lightly. "But I'm fine. I think it's just allergies." "Allergies don't attribute to the pale and clammy skin." He gestured to my frame. I was startled but looked to my hands. Sure enough, I was pale and sweating. For the first and last time in my life, I silently thanked Samuel. I wasn't going to have to fake very much. My gaze traveled the room as I thought of what else to say, but it landed on my coworkers who were now watching the scene play out before them. Usually no one wanted to be sent home, so they were anxious to see if our boss would actually do it. For many, a day without work was a day without food. I pretended to hold back a cough. "Really, I'm fine. I won't bother anyone." I had to put up a good fight, though I knew he would send me away. We all did. However, if I acted like I wanted to leave or got too anxious, he would know something was up. "Really, Samantha, you're not. I can't have you getting the customers sick." I looked into his crow's feet eyes, lowering my voice so the others couldn't hear me. "Please, Remy," I pleaded, sounding desperate. He looked away and seemed to debate for a moment. I would have been worried, but I knew what Remy would ultimately do. He wouldn't risk his business. "I can't risk you spreading your sickness to anything." He stressed the anything, referring to more than just the people that came to his restaurant. Though they didn't publicly reveal themselves, if you were paying attention, it wasn't hard to spot a werewolf. I sighed, choking on my words. "I understand. I'll go." Remy patted me on the back with his unusually large hands before leading me to the front of the building. I stopped outside the kitchen doors and went to shake his hand, but he pulled me into a hug. I froze momentarily, before reluctantly hugging him back. He whispered softly into my ear, "Good luck, Samantha." I pulled away immediately, shock and fear lining my features. He glanced around, patting my shoulder once more. When he saw no one in earshot, he smiled and again spoke softly. "You know, not everyone gets the chance you do. I tried, but they told me I was too high of a risk to go missing. But I was able to convince them to take you." I stared at him dumbfounded. I'd found someone to take me across the border months ago, but when I stated my case, they refused me. I never heard from them or anyone like them again. I was heartbroken. I couldn't understand why they would refuse me. A month went by and I'd almost given up until one night I returned home late. I found a hastily written note with a date, time, and place. I could only assume it was them, but I could never figure out what changed their minds. Now here it was standing in front of me. "You what? How?" My voice stuttered. He smiled warmly. "Well, after they told me no, and they saw I wasn't going to go crazy on them, they sort of included me on a few things going on around here. You were one of them." I couldn't find the words to speak. This man, who I had worked under for at least 3 years, was a complete mystery. He ignored my blank look, speaking faster now. "Samantha, just be careful. If Emily and the kids could go, I'd send them with you in a heartbeat. But I know they wouldn't make it. It's not easy out there," he grimaced. "Things have changed. But I know you're smart. You just have to remember to be smart. Now, do you have all the supplies you need?" I nodded, but he could see my hesitation. I have a bit. I had to give most of what I have to the hospital. Do you have enough for their payment? My heart stopped. Mistake number 2. Payment. Remy's eyes widened. Yes, the payment. They don't exactly do this for free. I hadn't even thought of that. I started. My mind was racing, trying to calculate how much I could spare. It wouldn't be enough for any form of payment. How much do they want? Remy looked my small frame up and down, biting his cheek. Wait here. I watched Remy's tall frame disappear. His black hair was pulled into a ponytail at the base of his head, and it swung as he rushed off. Not too much time passed before he was back in front of me, holding a grocery sack of something. I peered inside, taken aback by the amount of food a single plastic bag could hold. This was what I was saving up. I don't need it anymore. He thrust the bag into my hand, not letting me refuse him. My gaze moved between the bag and Remy, eyes wide. Sir, I can't take this, I began. I tried putting it back in his hands, but they were placed firmly on his hips. He cut me off. You can and you will. Now you need to get going and I have to get back. Do you have something to carry that in? I nodded slowly, my mind trying to catch up with the situation. Good. Don't be late tonight. They won't wait for you. Before I could breathe another word, Remy began pushing me out the door. When his hands left my back, I turned around to thank him, but he was already gone. I stood in place and gawked again at the supplies he'd given me. However, I soon felt a gaze on my back. I turned around and met curious onlookers, all of whom were sitting at various tables. I silently swore to myself, glancing at the clock above the door. I'd spent too much time in there. Rushing past the suspicious glances, I grabbed my sack from the corner and headed out the door. The bell rang once more, welcoming me into the fresh air. Chapter 9 Goodbyes Part 2. The fresh air greeted me like a hurricane. It was vast and overwhelming, and it reminded me of everything at stake. I didn't bother to look around as I rushed out of the restaurant. I quickly made my way through the alleyways, avoiding anyone I could. Though my body was on high alert, my mind was wandering. Thoughts of Remy swirled around, refusing to die out. Knowing that Remy was resisting this world, that he was with us, was unraveling my core by the minute. I couldn't help but think that if I had gone months, years maybe, without knowing about him, what else didn't I know? And would that lack of knowledge cause my delicate and reckless plan to crumble? Having reached their destination, my feet stopped walking. I was panting, staring up at a large glass building a few yards ahead. I stood in the shadow of an alley, attempting to size up the distance between myself and the hospital. Not only that, but size up the people surrounding it as well. Samuel was still out there. If he caught an inkling of my presence, I doubted I'd ever live to see another day. I knew I was running short on time, so I quickly deemed the road safe. My feet carried me forwards as I adjusted the sack, shifting it to my front. In the same motion, I swung my backpack onto my shoulders. I buried my face in the frayed cloth of the sack, taking extra care to make sure I wasn't seen by the countless cameras lining the streets. The cameras inside the hospital had broken a few weeks back, but luckily for me, no one deemed them important enough to fix. As I neared the sliding glass doors of the garish building, my heart began to swell. Even in this situation, I wasn't ready to see my brother again. It had been a few weeks since I had last been able to visit him, but the image of Will was forever ingrained in my mind. Though he wasn't conscious and couldn't speak, his body told me everything. It hadn't taken the unfair fight well. My mind reluctantly flashed back to the day it happened. The beating, the locked door, James' sadistic smile, the blood, and when Will got home, the fight. That night had broken me. Like usual, Will had gotten home from work in the middle of one of James' raging drunken episodes. Only this time James had taken it too far and Will was too late. He knew he didn't stand a chance, but Will attacked James. In the end, James shifted to his wolf, and it was all Will could do to survive the trip to the hospital. My mind was swept clean as my nose was suddenly met with the smell of cleansing alcohol and death. I ignored the smell and the bustle of people around me as I walked through the lobby, drawing nearer to the front desk. I noticed the woman immediately perk up at the sight of me, but I'm sure it was due to the large amount of supplies I held. There was no doubt she was getting paid tonight. Her eyes continued to dart from my supplies to my face, and I knew she recognized me. In this hospital, not many people had living patients to visit. I recognized her too, but hers wasn't a face you easily forgot. She had wild, bouncy red curls that fell to her shoulders, a petite face with hardly any signs of aging, and piercing bright blue eyes. As I drew closer, she began to smile. It spread across her entire face, lighting up her features. It was contagious. I placed my bag on the ground next to my feet before speaking. "Excuse me, is Dr. Gates around?" Her smile faltered, but her voice held the same perkiness expected. "She's busy with Mr. Bray at the moment. What can I help you with?" I grimaced. That name wasn't one that I wanted to hear today. "Is she all right? I just need to drop off a payment and speak to her about Will." "She's probably fine," the woman, Gracie as her name tag read, lied. It wasn't hard to catch her. Then again, we both knew the answer to my question. "If you were speaking to Peyton Bray, you were not fine. She did tell me that she wanted to talk to you about your brother in person though, so I'm afraid you might have to wait a while." I breathed deeply as my heart rate began to climb. "How long has she been with him? Do you know when they'll be done?" "She has been back there with him for a while now, but I'm not sure. He seemed pretty upset when he came in this morning." I mulled over my options. I knew it wasn't a possibility to be in this lobby when Peyton Bray walked out. He was one of the few that was known to be a werewolf, and that wasn't due to a kind personality. Peyton Bray was one of the top-tiered wolves, and he had no qualms about letting you know. "Is it alright if I just head on back to see Will? I can leave the payment with you." Gracie's eyebrows raised. "Of course, but didn't you want to speak to her?" I sighed. I truly did. But I couldn't stay and risk more than I already was. "Yes, but I can't wait today. I need to get back to work. I just wanted to make sure his treatment is paid for." "Oh, okay. Of course. Just give me the supplies and I'll go lock them up. You can head on up if you like," she smiled warmly. I returned the gesture. "Thanks." She paused before turning away from me. "You know, all of us here have grown quite fond of Will. We're all rooting for him." My eyebrows raised, giving her a questioning glance. It wasn't normal for the hospital staff to stick around their patients. At least not for the human ones. They never healed fast enough. Gracie noticed my change in frame and gave a small laugh. "He's a tough man. I guess we can't help but put a little hope in him." She looked around, opening and closing her mouth a few times. However, there were too many listening ears for her to say much more. I gave her half a smile. "He is tough, but he's also stubborn. Sometimes I think he's only staying alive to prove that a human can do it." While she laughed, I pulled my sack up from the ground and handed it over the marble counter. She graciously took the supplies and gestured towards the stairs. "I'm sure you know the way. I'll let Dr. Gates know you were here." I thanked her, quickly turning around to begin my journey up the stairs. It was a long walk, but I needed it to clear my head. People wouldn't stop surprising me today, and it was taking me off guard. I needed them to stop so that I could focus. I reached Will's room in a record amount of time. My body wanted to barge through the door and say a quick goodbye, but my heart held me back. Because James hadn't told us exactly what the doctor said, I had no idea what to expect. I could only hope it was better than last time. The metal handle creaked as I pushed it down, opening the thick door to reveal a small room. It was quaint and simple with a large window covering the side wall. There was a single hospital bed with a blue curtain pushed behind it, as there was no need for privacy. A bare and wooden bedside table sat next to the bed, only narrowly avoiding the slew of cords wrapped behind it. On top of the bed lay a still figure with countless monitors and tubes hooked onto every inch of its body. I inched forward and stared at Will, holding my breath the whole time. He was barely recognizable. His usual blonde hair was darkened with sweat and matted to his forehead. There were no brown eyes peering into my own. His body was stiff and still. Most importantly, it was broken. Every inch of it. A sob choked at the back of my throat, but I held it back. I tried to tell myself he looked better than before. The bruises had started to fade, and his skin was now only a sickly yellow shade instead of vibrant blue and purple. There was no more blood. His legs were elevated and he looked less swollen. Still, he wasn't a pretty sight. And he was still asleep. I moved a chair from the corner of the room closer to his bed, placing it next to the table. I slid my backpack onto that before taking a deep breath. Sitting down, I placed my hands on his arm while steering clear of the needles and broken bones. It was hard to recognize Will, but I knew he was there. Not only physically but mentally too. The doctor's biggest fear was that he'd received permanent brain damage and wouldn't pull through. But he'd surprised us all. The coma had his consciousness captive, but the tests told us despite the trauma, his brain was alive. "Hey Will," I spoke softly, watching Will's face. It stayed in the same deadened state. "Sorry I didn't come by again sooner. Things got a little complicated." I paused, but again there was nothing. No response. I sighed but kept talking. Even if he couldn't respond, it was nice to pretend to talk to him. He'd always been my confidant. "I brought the supplies for your next surgery. Hopefully, this one will be the one to finally get your lazy ass out of bed." I laughed to myself, continuing to watch his face. I measured his breathing, letting it calm me. "Mom's doing all right. Nothing's changed there. I know she wants to come see you, but our favorite werewolf won't let her. Apparently, you're getting what you deserve. I think she might come to see you anyway. But don't worry. I've told her not to. I know you wouldn't want her getting hurt just so she could catch a glimpse of your sorry butt. I don't want her hurt either." I sighed again, then looked the room once over. I'd been wanting to say this out loud, and I knew the only person I could tell was Will. "Speaking of wolves, I've got some news." I looked around the room once again, lowering my voice for good measure. "I have a moron following me around who thinks I'm his mate." I paused, letting that sink in. I considered what Will would actually say if he could speak. His voice almost rang through my mind. "Don't let those bastards get you down, Sammy. Those dogs are stupid idiots. Give 'em hell. And don't give in." I smiled this time, letting a stray tear cascade down my cheek. "I'm scared, Will." I breathed out the sentence, hardly hearing my own voice. I hadn't let myself think about it until now, but I truly was terrified. If I got caught, they'd kill me and anyone who knew anything. That meant my mom and maybe even Will. I didn't care if I died, but I couldn't handle the thought of my family dying as well. "You know, he can't hear you." I couldn't even hear that. I whipped around at the new voice, quickly wiping the tears from my eyes. My gaze fell upon Dr. Gates, who was standing in the doorway. "Oh, I know," I stuttered. "Just feels like I'm talking to him." "You didn't hear anything, did you?" I said, trying not to act guilty. I try not to eavesdrop on others' conversations, even if they are one-sided. "So no, I didn't hear anything. I actually just got off the phone with Gracie. She told me you were up here." I got the chance to fully take her in, now that my surprise had faded. Her black hair was tied tightly behind both of her ears and rested at the base of her neck. She had fair skin and small eyes. As I took in her appearance, I noticed the swelling and redness lining her face and neck. She noticed my gaze and cleared her throat. I looked down apologetically. I suddenly felt as if I was a child that needed scolding. "Sorry," I mumbled, turning back to Will. I heard her sigh. "It's all right. I've just been in a meeting with Mr. Bray. Gracie told me." I hesitated before continuing. I knew she was a private woman, and I didn't want to offend the only human doctor in the city. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, thank you," she told me stiffly. I nodded slowly at her response, knowing she was far from all right. "Forgive me," she sighed. "It's just been a long day. Mr. Bray was upset about the procedure we have coming up for Will." I shot my eyes back to her, worry tracing my expression. "What's wrong?" "He believes that it isn't worth it." "I disagree." I nodded again, knowing what disagreeing with Peyton Bray resulted in. I'd heard the rumors. The marks on her neck only added to their truthfulness. "So how is he?" I asked her quietly, dismissing the subject. "Better." "I'm not sure if your father told you." "Stepfather," I interrupted. "Apologies. I'm not sure if your stepfather told you, but we are placing an ICP in his skull. It will help us monitor the pressure in his brain cavity. We've fixed most of the bleeding in his brain, but I want to watch the swelling." I paused, taking in the information. "I left the payment with Gracie. Is it enough?" I looked up and met her bright eyes. They softened a bit at my question. "I'm sure it will be enough. We've got to start running a few tests though, so I'm afraid your time with Will is up for the day." I looked back at Will, memorizing his features. I didn't know when or if I would see him again. My eyes fell where his should be, and I silently said my goodbyes. I promised he'd pull through. I promised no one would hurt him again. I promised him I'd come back. I promised him we'd be all right. Chapter 10 Trucks. My feet pounded down the stairs, oblivious to my surroundings. I half ran through the lobby and out the sliding doors before I even stopped to look around. That was mistake number 3. As soon as I left the hospital, I started for the alleyways. Before I could get there, though, my name was being called. Samantha. The gruff and slurred voice met my ears. I stopped dead in my tracks, fear overcoming me with the sound. I suddenly couldn't speak, move, or breathe. My heart struggled to keep up with the panic. What are you doing here? My body slowly turned, coming face to face with James as he emerged from the side of the hospital. He had on his usual work attire, though it was quite more grungy than usual. The blue-collared shirt was only half tucked in and the company's white lettering was stained brown. I stared at his frame, too afraid to make eye contact. Silent moments passed as I fought the urge to run. Answer me, girl, he growled, closing the distance between us. I looked around, my desperation flooding the street. I tried to catch someone's glance and a few people stopped to see the commotion. Once they saw James' powerful frame, however, they continued on. No one wanted to challenge a stranger. I'm sorry. You caught me off guard, my voice squeaked as my gaze lifted to his face. I cleared my throat, trying not to reveal my fear. I knew he only played off it. His eyes darkened slightly, clearly noticing what I tried to hide. Aren't you supposed to be at work? What the hell are you doing next to the hospital? I am working, I started, noticing the stench of alcohol on his breath. My boss needed me to pick up something from a vendor in the park. The park was only a block from here. If he hadn't seen me leaving the hospital, the lie might work. I watched his features carefully as he studied my own. His eyes were narrowed as he glanced from my face to the street behind us. I'm supposed to meet him any minute now, I continued quickly, hoping to escape the situation. James' calculating expression turned to a sneer. Well, that's fine, innit? We can spend some time together tonight. My body stiffened and I involuntarily stepped back. What's the matter, girl? Didn't ya like it last time? No words would come to me as my mind was being flooded with horrifying memories that refused to leave. My mother's sobs filled my mind, filling in space between my own screams. My hand flinched to my lower back and I felt my skin slicing open all over again. I'd paid the price for standing up to him. A bloody, unforgettable price. My body had healed since then, but my mind refused to follow. So quiet today. Maybe that means you learned your lesson. My heart continued to speed up as he reached his hand forward, grabbing my broken wrist. As he tightened his grip, I let out a pleading gasp. He only smiled wider, glancing back into the shadows. His body tensed as he prepared to drag me back to hell. Suddenly a new voice met our ears, ringing through the street. Mr. Craven, what are you doing here? James froze. His body stiffened as he turned around, blocking me from view. He still held my wrist captive in his hand, refusing to let me slip away. Mr. Bray, it's a surprise to see you here. James' voice was suddenly devoid of all alcohol, leaving formality in its wake. I struggled slightly as the new voice spoke until it dawned on me who was speaking. Suddenly, I was appreciative of James hiding me from view, even if it was for the wrong reasons. I'd rather face James than one of the Alpha's designated enforcers. Aren't you supposed to be in the sewers today? Peyton Bray's voice was cold. I was just heading there until I found my daughter in the streets. I'm sending her back to work and then I'll be on my way. That better be the case. There was a long pause as the two of them seemed to stare each other down. There was no doubt in my mind that James would lose. An exile like him didn't stand up to one of Riley's henchmen. Well, he finished with finality. James begrudgingly turned around and faced me, tightening the grip on my wrist. I winced in pain but held back any noise. A low snarl escaped his lips, too low for Mr. Bray to hear. We'll finish this tonight. I nodded in response, intent on never seeing him again. Without warning, he released my hand and stalked back into the alley. I was suddenly in the middle of the road, directly facing the deadliest thing I knew. I bent my head low and let my brown hair fall over my features. With any luck, he would continue on and pay me no heed. I was, after all, only human. Why are you still here? He spat in my direction, earning a quiet yelp from me. I'm sorry, sir. I'm leaving. My voice was barely above a whisper, but I knew he heard me. I turned to quickly disappear back into the alley, praying he didn't stop me again. When I heard no voice, I walked faster. I didn't dare glance behind me, in fear that he would see my face and drag me back to Samuel. Or worse, the Alpha. I expected my heart to slow down with the distance between myself and the two wolves I'd just encountered, but it did the opposite. The longer I walked, the more the anxiety built. With each setting ray of sun, my mind slipped further into darkness. My hands shook, my breathing was labored, and I attracted the glance of more than one person. I couldn't pin down what had me acting so erratically, which was driving me further to the brink. I'd arrived at the meetup location several minutes ago, but I couldn't make myself walk any further. Self-doubt was running rampant as debilitating thoughts ran through my ears. Something was going to happen. I was going to ruin everything. I was going to get killed. I could never actually pull this off. I was standing outside the town's grocery store, once again hidden by the shadows. As I crouched in my place attempting to steady my breathing, I noticed a petite figure exit the store. Initially, I paid it no mind until it started walking towards me. I saw the feminine frame weave in and out of other people until she'd passed them all. At that point, she was practically standing next to me. "Are you coming?" Her voice was full and authoritative. I'd been avoiding her gaze, but at her question, I slowly raised my eyes. I realized, looking her over, that I had no idea who I was actually supposed to be looking for. She had dark chocolate skin that matched her eyes and black ringlets cropped short. A simple t-shirt adorned her back, matching the color of her jeans. With a start, I realized she could be anyone. She could be with anyone. "Who are you?" I questioned, slightly paranoid. "You're Samantha," she countered, resting her hands on her hips. "Yes. Well, I came to tell you that if you don't get up, then the car is leaving without you." I sprang from my position at her words, suddenly very aware of the time I'd wasted and who she was. "I'm sorry, I'm coming. I just got distracted." She laughed. First time fleeing a country. I looked at her dumbfounded until I realized she was joking. Yeah, I forced a laugh. "This is a first for me." "Well, luckily for you, we got a pretty great driver. Come on." Her voice turned serious again as she gestured for me to follow. I walked a pace behind her, not sure where she was leading me. No one noticed us coming out of the side street, and we easily fell into step with the countless others heading inside the store. However, when everyone reached the entrance, we walked past them. Instead, we moved to the side of the stone walls, walking around the side of the building. We stuck close to the sandy material until we came upon two white trucks in the back parking lot. The woman walked towards them and I followed suit. Before long, I noticed three others leaning nonchalantly against the back of the trucks. The woman ignored the others, pushing them aside. She reached into the bed of the truck, pulling out clothing that matched her own. "Put these on," she said as she thrust the clothes into my hands. I hesitated, staring first at the walls of the store, then the others watching me. "There's no cameras back here." A new voice spoke. I noticed it was one of the men's. He had tan skin and dark hair that fell over his face and past his shoulders. "Thanks," I mumbled before walking to the other side of the truck. I quickly changed into the new clothing, surprised at the perfect fit. I walked back around the car, my old clothes bundles in my good hand. Before I could ask what to do with them, the woman took them. She threw them at the other woman who was leaning on the truck with the two men. "Burn these." She quickly agreed, her blonde hair bouncing across her forehead. I tried to watch her walk back into the store, curious as to how she got around without being noticed. My attention, however, was ripped away. "Samantha, you need to listen." The woman was snapping her fingers close to my face. "No need to be so harsh, Margaret. I'm pretty sure she's terrified." The man that spoke before spoke again, smiling in my direction. She shot the man a stern look before turning to me. "Samantha, if you don't want to do this, you need to say so now. This isn't a game and there is no going back. If you change your mind, then you will get us all killed." The woman Margaret impatiently tapped her foot and looked at her watch. I tried not to glare at her as I responded, my courage suddenly crashing over me. "I know this isn't a game. I'm doing this. I'm ready." My resolve was back. There was no way I was throwing away my shot. The man who spoke started a slow clap, but Margaret again ignored him. She looked to the other man who, up to this point, had been quiet and still. She held out her hand and he came forward, placing a small black device in her palm. "Right. I need your phone," she started, fixing the black piece until it was settled into her ear. I don't have one. She gave me a challenging look. Phones can be traced. If you have one, it has to go. I held up my hands. I'm telling the truth. My mother's husband didn't want us to have them. Margaret nodded and motioned towards the men. All right. Cade, Jack, start the cars. Make sure your radios are on. Here's the plan, she started, pulling me towards the trunk. These cars go out every month to a wolf pack outside of town to bring them supplies. You're the new apprentice. You don't speak, move, hell, you don't even breathe. Let Cade do the talking. If they ask, your name is Haley and you're Cade's sister. Once we're out of town, we'll drive a few miles north, just to the edge of the forest. There's a spot where the patrol is at its lightest and we'll drop you there. Then you'll be on your own. There are some safe houses along the way that will take you in and tell you where to go. When you're out of the country, we'll get in contact with you again. Don't try to find us. Don't try to get in on the fight. It's safer up there and the wolf presence minimal, but we can't chance anything. We're going to need you later. She finished her rushed speech and I only nodded, taking in the new information. Margaret didn't wait for my vocal response as she pulled me to the passenger side door. I now noticed the blankets and tarps covering the various food and water jugs in the bed of the truck, buzzing slightly with the hum of the engine. The passenger door was opened and I was shoved roughly inside by Margaret's small hands. When the door shut, I was met with laughter. I turned and stared wide-eyed at the man next to me. I noticed it was the same man who'd been speaking and adding his 2 cents before. I'm Cade, he spoke as he pulled the car into reverse, following Margaret and her driver. Samantha, I told him quietly. He glanced over at me before returning his gaze to the road. Don't let her freak you out. She's too serious for her own good. She gives me that same we're going to die speech every day. It hasn't happened yet. Okay, I responded, furrowing my brows. Silence fell for a few moments as the trucks turned onto the main road. There weren't many cars out today, so the journey through town was easy. I found myself slipping down my chair, avoiding the gaze of the people on the street. Who are you running from? Cade suddenly questioned, voice heightening with curiosity. I glanced his direction, not sure if I should tell him the truth. He was one of those people you could trust too easily, and I didn't want to fall into that trap. My stepfather. Cade nodded, his hair flying forward and back with the exaggerated movement. Daddy issues. I dig it. He's not my dad, I automatically interjected. He smiled, letting out a large sigh. All right, big daddy issues. He laughed and I couldn't help but smile in return. It wasn't a joking matter, but his light demeanor made it seem better than it actually was. What about you? I questioned. Me. My dad's a good guy. A bit of a slob, though. No, I laughed. What are you doing caught up in all this? His voice lost a touch of the humor. Well, you could say I got some vendettas against the dogs. They took something of mine and I want it back. I scrunched my eyebrows. What did they take? He hesitated, and it was enough to bring me back to reality. It had been so long since I'd had a casual conversation with someone that I'd forgotten people didn't like to spill their life stories. I should have known better. I was the same way. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. I started, but he interrupted me. It's fine. Most people just don't really care. I took in his words, acknowledging their truth. Yeah, I guess that's true. Most people have their own shit to deal with. He laughed and it immediately lightened the mood. I decided to try my chances on another subject. So how did all this happen? I mean, how did you all come to be? Come to start helping people and whatnot? Cade frowned thoughtfully. Well, what do you know? My mother and I heard rumors about someone that helped people like us. I found him, he told me no. And a week later I found a note in my bedroom. Classic Zeke, he laughed. Well, it's a long story, really. I'm pretty sure we have time, I said, watching the town slowly pass by. The border was at least another hour's drive. Cade looked at me, letting his grip on the steering wheel relax. The smile was still plastered on his face as he began to tell me the story of the resistance. Chapter 11, discussing a mutual hatred. Well, how far back do you want me to go? Cade mused, eyes trained on the road. I thought for a moment before responding. I already know the basics. I mean, I was so young when it happened, but my mother's told me a bit. There was a war, the wolves obviously won, etc. I don't know anything more than that. That is the basics of it, Cade started, eyes trained on the road. How old were you when it happened? About 10. Old enough. I paused, seizing the chance to ask him to elaborate. What was it like? His hands tightened and released the steering wheel a couple more times before responding. When he did, all trace of humor was gone. First it was nothing. People just kept disappearing. The news told us it was terrorists, drug lords, stuff like that. Then, the people who disappeared started showing up again. Only they weren't themselves anymore. They were werewolves, I finished, glancing out the window. The one and only. Once that happened, no one could deny their existence. Then the story changed to peace. The government had found a new way to live longer or some shit like that. But people kept on disappearing, including the higher-ups. Before long, more than half of every country's government was gone. Companies were falling, supplies were limited, and most everything went under. They told us it was fine, but we knew it wasn't. Small fights broke out here and there, but people were mostly just scared and starting to panic. We knew something was coming. Before long, at least everybody had lost some member of their family, if not multiple. That's when we finally realized it. They were building themselves up. Building an army, so to speak. Trying to outnumber us. At that point we tried to fight back, but by then it was too late. I let out a small breath, thinking of my family during that time. I didn't remember anything, so I drew my own conclusions. My mother never talked about him, but I knew by common sense that at one point I'd had a father. I didn't like to think of him often, for fear of what his story might be. There wasn't much of a chance he was human anymore or alive. Cade's words only added to those suspicions. That's when the war started, isn't it? I asked, focusing back on the big picture. He nodded. They almost outnumbered us by the time we saw what was actually happening. We didn't stand a chance. But why? Why did they do it? Why does any predator attack? To get stronger. To get control. If you ask me, they're just waiting until they can change or kill us all. Humans are weak compared to them. They need to be killed off. To them, it's just a matter of time before we stop fighting and surrender. I shuddered at his last sentence, hugging my body close. Are they all like that? He thought for a moment. Have you met one that isn't? I thought about Samuel. He didn't seem overly dangerous, but I was still scared of him and what he could do. He controlled me, yelled at me, followed me, insulted me, told me I was his, and alluded to the fact that if it were up to him, I wouldn't be human much longer. He never physically hurt me, but the threat was always there. Cade took my silence as an answer. They're ruthless and savage animals, Samantha. They take what they want and they don't want humans. We managed to get rid of a lot of them, but they always make more. I nodded. So how did we start fighting against them? That's a bit of a happier story, Cade smiled. One that isn't even finished. No. I questioned. Definitely not. We haven't won yet. I smiled at his faith and enthusiasm. Up until this point, I'd only thought about getting out of town so my family and I could be free. It never really went beyond that, even though I knew the war was raging and destroying other towns and countries. It's hard to think of what you can do to resist when you're already defeated. In the beginning, after the initial formal attacks, people started banding together. I don't know all the details. No one really does unless you were there. But leaders rose up. We found their weakness. We exploited it. Those groups slowly spread and we've now got a resistance almost everywhere. It's taken time, but as they used to say, Rome wasn't built in a day. I mulled over his explanation. It was vague, but like he said, it was an ongoing story. So what's their weakness then? He snorted. You don't know. My eyes narrowed. Of course I didn't know. The only werewolf I'd ever been in direct contact with, up until 2 weeks ago, was James. He didn't exactly spell out how to kill him. No, I stated firmly. I'm not exactly an expert in the supernatural. I'm not either, but I know how to kill a werewolf, he taunted. I let out an abrupt sigh, not sure whether or not to argue with him. You wouldn't think that he'd be as childlike as he was at his age, and it was throwing me off. He was several years older than me but acted the opposite. In the end, it was hard to be truly upset with his boyish demeanor. I haven't had a lot of contact with them. My family's exiled. Well, my stepfather is exiled. We kind of have to pay that price too. Cade nodded again, the movement bigger than necessary. Well, I guess that's acceptable, he laughed. They really only have 2 big weaknesses. Everything else kind of falls under the 2 main ones. I waited in anticipation as he continued. Elaborate plans for attacks and poisons raced through my mind, trying to guess what exactly would work. It had to be complex and strong if it were to do any damage to their seemingly invincible bodies. One is silver, he stated matter-of-factly. I scoffed. Silver. Yep, he popped the word. I know what you're thinking, but it turns out the old wives' tale is true. Anything silver will hurt them. We don't really know why, but we don't need to for it to be effective. I paused, bringing my knees up to my chest. It made sense. They got rid of money, took over all the companies, and controlled everything. It'd be easy for them to get rid of it. Or at least control whoever produced it. "'Kay, what's the other one?" I questioned lightly. "Mates." I choked on my spit, sending my body into a coughing attack. Cade slowed the car, but I signaled I was fine. He looked at me anxiously as I tried to regain my composure. "Mates? Why?" I finally choked out. He raised an eyebrow. "Well, they're kind of a werewolf's entire existence. You have to know about them. You know about them, don't you?" "Yeah, I know about fucking mates," practically growled. He leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. That was a pretty strong response. I ignored him and looked out the window once more. Again, his answer made sense, but that didn't mean I had to like or agree with it. If that statement were true, it meant Samuel would be going out of his mind to find me. That made my chances of escape extremely slim. Buildings were slowly disappearing, being replaced with bright green trees. I noticed the road becoming rougher, the pavement coming to an end. The car slowed to meet the new gravel, careful not to knock the contents of the truck around. I was suddenly aware of how far out of town we were. I tried to look through the trees and glanced behind us, watching for anything that might be following. Cade suddenly laughed. I turned to glare at him, but his face was alight with knowledge. "You're running from a mate," he exclaimed, wiggling his finger in my direction. "You know, it's a good thing Margaret didn't know about that. She'd have lost her shit." "I am not," I started to protest. However, he caught me in his gaze and I knew there was no point in denying it. "So what if I am?" He chuckled. "There's no doubt he'll go batshit crazy. I almost feel sorry for that bastard." He paused and looked up for a moment, pouting his lip. "Almost." I smiled, looking down to the ground. It was nice to openly talk about a mutual hatred. "So who is it?" I scoffed. "We're not that close, Cade. Do you love him?" I turned to him wide-eyed. "Obviously not. Do you see him here with me?" "No." "Well, that's because he's an awful—" I struggled to find the right words. "He's an awful, controlling, stupid motherfu." He raised his palms in surrender. Okay. I get the point. I mean, granted, he doesn't sound that different from the rest of them, so it's not a hard picture to get. How far out are we?" I asked, very much wanting to change the conversation. Cade looked at the dashboard and then at our surroundings. "I'd say 10 minutes until we reach the border. From there, it'll be another 2 hours until we drop you off." I sighed. Everything was so big. The next 10 minutes passed in silence, each of us caught in our own thoughts. I was sure Cade was trying to figure out who my mate was, and I was busy making sure not to let him come anywhere close to knowing. No one ever could. "All right, Margaret told you the plan, right?" Cade suddenly questioned. I realized the cars were slowing to a stop, gates suddenly popping up all around us. They were tall and wired with spikes lining the tops. Every few feet guards walked and paced, watching each foreign movement with inhuman eyes. "Don't talk, don't move, don't breathe," I repeated her words. Cade smiled but didn't respond. Instead, he rolled down his window, pulling the car forward a couple inches. His smile started to fade as a large older man walked to the car. His hair was clipped short, gray hairs mixing in with the blonde. Though his face betrayed his age, apart from that you would have thought he was in his prime. His shoulders were large and broad, arms flexing underneath the black shirt he wore. A scowl was lining his features, only enhancing his menacing demeanor. Cade and I both lowered our gazes when he came to the window. "State your case," he spoke loudly. "Delivering supplies to the Blue Eye Pack, sir." Cade spoke monotonously. The man looked at Cade, around the truck, and then to me. He motioned for another man to look into the bed of the truck as he continued speaking. "Let's see some identification." Cade slowly pulled his hand to his jeans pocket, pulling out 2 small sheets of paper. The man studied them carefully, his gaze occasionally glancing up to me. "She's new." My heart fluttered. "She's the new apprentice, sir," Cade stated. He hesitated when the guard stood still. I apologize, it's her first delivery. We thought you were aware. I marveled at how he kept his even tone and spoke only the truth. Technically, I was an apprentice for them, and this was my first time out of town. They didn't have to know the rest of the story to believe his words. The man turned to me, looking me up and down. I was uncomfortable under his gaze, but again I didn't move. I didn't think I could. Every scenario of this situation going wrong was on repeat in my mind, and every scenario ended with Samuel killing me. With each passing moment, my chest grew tighter until I felt as if my skin was going to split under the pressure. My eyes darted between our open window and the surrounding area, ready to run if needed. I knew I wouldn't get far, but I wasn't going back without a fight. It was in that moment that I decided I'd rather die than face home again. The man backed away from the car for a moment, gesturing for someone else to take a look at our papers. I saw Cade tense slightly, but he said nothing. By this time Margaret's car had already slipped through the gate, and they were waiting for us on the other side. Painful minutes passed and Cade snuck a glance at me. He smiled slightly, trying to reassure my shaking body. However, his reassurances did nothing. I knew we were dead. Eventually, the guard examining the truck supplies came forward and made a signal. The blonde-haired man came back to our window, grunted again, letting his gaze on me linger. Almost begrudgingly, he sighed and handed us our sheets of paper. With a final movement, he waved his hand and backed away. We slowly drove forward again, inching until we met the other white truck. Once the gates were closed behind us, we set off down the road. We drove for several minutes before I let out a large and shaky breath. I glanced behind us and dared a smile when I saw no one following. Cade looked at me and laughed slightly, though I noticed his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. He suddenly released one of his death grips and threw his arm upwards, fist clenched. He then brought it slowly back down to his side, mocking a cheer. He repeated this motion several times until he was practically bouncing in his chair. I laughed at his crazy actions, my mood lightening instantly. Well, Samantha, I'd like to officially welcome you to your freedom. Tell me, how does it feel? I mimicked his toothy grin. Why, thank you, Cade. Truly is an honor. I stared at our surroundings. They hadn't changed, but I felt as if I were in an entirely new world. Feels freeing. He laughed at my bad joke and I followed suit. I took a moment to again look out the window, hardly letting myself believe what happened. We actually made it. So what happens to you after this? I suddenly questioned. He thought for a moment. Nothing really. I go back to town. Keep living my life and fighting where I can. I doubt that once they know you're gone we'll be able to sneak someone out like this again, what with your mate freaking out and all. Is he high-ranking? I ignored his question, too afraid they'd take me back if they knew the answer. Are you guys going to be okay? I countered, a tinge of guilt starting to stab at my stomach. If Samuel knew that they had helped me escape, they'd face worse than death. I suddenly realized it wasn't only mine and my family's lives at stake, but theirs too. They'd all risked everything. Don't worry about us. We'll be fine. They'd have to catch us first. I rolled my eyes, 'cause that'd be really hard. He ignored my taunt and smiled. A thought suddenly came to me, and I couldn't help but voice it. Cade, I know I shouldn't be asking this, but can you do me a favor? His eyebrows raised. What is it? I just don't have anyone to look after my mom or brother once I'm gone. Can you just keep an eye on them? I can give you their names. He nodded in understanding. Sure, I can do that. Thank you. Thank you for everything, I sighed. I know you guys are putting your asses on the line for me, and I'm not sure why, but I'm grateful. You're welcome, he said uncomfortably. We're just trying to help everyone we can. We're in this together. We know what's at stake. Maybe you can pay us back someday. I nodded. They weren't naive in the affairs of the world. They welcomed the war and fought in it, standing up for what they believed in. I envied their courage. It's a pretty long drive from here. You should probably get some sleep. Who knows when you'll get it again? I thought about his words but realized he was right. My eyes closed and I doubted I'd sleep. But before long I was slipping into unconsciousness. Chapter 12. Into the woods I awoke to trees. Never-ending masses of vibrant green spotted with shades of wood. It would have been a beautiful sight, but the sun was well into its descent. Shadows were carelessly dancing across the gravel, attempting to swallow the trucks who dared to invade their space. It was suffocating. I took in my surroundings, waking from my light sleep, and looked over to Cade. His body was relaxed and his face neutral, but I could tell he was deep in thought. He noticed my stirring and glanced over at me, smiling quickly. I was just about to wake you up. We're not too far from the drop-off. I stretched my limbs, preparing them for the walking they were about to do. It was then I noticed the backpack at my feet, filled with my own supplies and their payment. I almost forgot, I told him, rummaging through the bag. He watched my movements from the corner of his eye as he kept one hand on the steering wheel. I pulled out the grocery sack Remy had given me, removing 2 or 3 items from the bag for myself. I put the few things back in my backpack and held out the rest for Cade. "What's that?" he asked. I hesitated. "A payment." Understanding light up his face. "Oh, that's right. You can give it to Margaret." But he drew out the last word. I noticed the car slowing down as he stopped it momentarily. When we were at a standstill, he reached for the sack. He took out several more items and stuffed them into my backpack before giving me a small smirk. "You need more than an hour's worth of food and water." "But that leaves you with hardly anything," I protested. He let out a short laugh. "We're not the ones running through the woods for a couple of days. I think we'll be all right." His gaze lingered on mine, carefully watching my eyes. I looked again to the backpack, comparing it to the volume of the plastic sack. Cade had given me almost all of the supplies. I pointedly stared at it, not quite sure what to do. "I really can manage with less," I disagreed. Cade broke his gaze and rolled his eyes, pulling the car forward once again. "Trust me, you really can't." "Well then, thank you," I huffed out a breath, trying to hide my excitement. The extra supplies really would help. I might stand a chance now. I told myself I'd find food and water along the way, but I knew the slim chances of that actually happening. Now I didn't have to worry and could focus solely on running. "Are we almost there?" "Just a bit further," he told me before hesitating. "So what's your plan?" "My plan? Yeah, like how are you going to make it all the way up north?" I paused. I hadn't thought I'd actually make it this far. "By walking, I guess." Cade laughed once. "Do you know the direction?" "North?" I questioned. He looked at me, worried now. Lines crinkled their way into the corners of his eyes along with a solid one filling his forehead. "Samantha, do you know anything past this point?" I let out a long breath of air and thought carefully. "I have enough supplies to make it to the varying safe houses. I'll ask directions at each one, I guess. I brought some warmer clothes for the nights and I'll find shelter in between the houses. What about your scent?" I paused, my face paling. I hadn't thought of that. I stuttered, trying to figure out how I could fool a wolf's most powerful tool, especially one that probably had my scent memorized. Cade saw my white face and only laughed at my unease, placing one of his hands lightly upon my own. "You're killing me," he drawled, not removing his hand. "There's not a lot you can do for your scent apart from try and get a lead. Just stay upwind. Don't worry about that too much, though. It'd be hard for anyone to follow you out here. All you probably smell like is this truck and me." The car suddenly stopped. I looked up from our conversation, noticing we weren't in an area that looked particularly different from anywhere else. The trees still looped over the road, and now that we were stopped it felt as if they'd succeeded in swallowing us. "Here," Cade said as he put the car in park. He proceeded to slip off his jacket, his shirt rising slightly with the action. Ignoring this, he handed me the dark material. "Wear this. It'll confuse the scent a bit more if anyone manages to get this far." I took the jacket gratefully. "I wish I had something give you in return." "Don't worry about it. Like I said, you can pay us back someday. We'll count it as a favor." I smiled warmly in his direction. Through the fading light, it was getting harder to read his expressions. However, his smile was still curled around his face, crinkling his eyes. He held my gaze for a moment too long, and I watched his expression falter slightly. His eyes got serious, pleading even, and he opened his mouth to say something. However, he was quickly interrupted. "Cade, Margaret was suddenly at our window." I jumped at the sudden appearance but quickly started gathering my things. Cade swiftly exited the car, leaving me to finish my preparations. I made sure my backpack was secure before slipping his jacket over my head. I lingered in the truck for just a moment, preparing myself to enter the wilderness. I never was one to love the forest, considering all the dangers it held. Now I'd be living in it for days on end. I quietly jumped from the truck and walked around to the front to meet them. By the time I got there, they were whispering harshly to each other. I tried to catch a word of what they were saying, but they fell silent at my appearance. I coughed uncomfortably, suddenly very ready to get out of here. "Here's the payment," I told Margaret, handing her the small sack. She didn't so much as glance at it before tossing it into the bed of the truck. I watched her stiff movements, wondering what could have her so worked up. Flashbacks of mine and Cade's conversation in the car came to mind, but I was sure Cade wouldn't reveal what I was running from. He'd been looking out for me, helping me. He wouldn't stop now. "Thank you so much for everything," I told them both, attempting to break a now awkward silence. "It's nothing," Cade told me. "There should be safe houses up the way several miles." "I suggest you don't stop until you get there," Margaret spoke for the first time. I nodded my head in response while slipping my backpack onto my shoulders. The weight gave me a newfound excitement and determination. After adjusting the straps, I looked at them both. I caught them in the middle of exchanging firm glances with one another, silent communication raving through their faces. I could feel something off, but I quickly brushed it away. I'd be gone in a matter of moments and wouldn't have to worry about them. "All right, Samantha," Margaret sighed. "Just don't get killed. We'll know if you make it." She abruptly left and stalked towards her car, slipping into the passenger seat with ease. "Well, I believe that's your cue," Cade laughed. I nodded, smirking. "I believe it is." I opened my mouth to say goodbye, but before I could, I was enveloped in Cade's arms. My body froze involuntarily, and he either didn't notice or care. After a few moments, I felt my arms wrapping around his waist. I didn't know what I was doing or why he was hugging me for so long, but I did have to admit it felt nice. "Be careful, all right?" He spoke softly into my hair without breaking the embrace. I started to pull away, but he held me closer. "Cade," I protested, suddenly claustrophobic. "Just a second longer. You'll smell like me." I could only nod. I knew he had good intentions, but the captivity of his arms only brought back painful memories. My arms held him for a bit longer as I endured the embrace until I couldn't stand it anymore. Slowly, I peeled my arms back and he did the same, though somewhat reluctantly. He laughed when I noticed this, brushing it quickly to the side. I retreated from his tall frame, my footsteps crinkling in the leaves and sticks beneath me. "I'll see you later, Cade. Thank you again." He smiled and waved as I turned my back, heading for the line of trees. My heart started pounding harder in my chest the closer I drew. Now that I was directly underneath them, I realized how vast they were. Each tree was a different shape, size, and type, but they were all the sizes of small buildings. I wanted to hesitate to turn back, but I knew Cade was watching. For some reason, this gave me the confidence I needed to move forward, pushing through the first line of brush. I let Cade's jacket fall past my hands, the material shielding my skin from the protruding branches and thorns. I kept walking forward until I could no longer see the light from the cars. At this point, I finally turned around, panting slightly. Like I'd thought, I was fully enveloped in the forest. The bright greens of the trees were dying down with the light, replacing the once vibrant color with a monotonous black. I realized that with the trees, the ground had also turned dark. The various uprooted timber and fallen branches were hidden to my view as I blindly stumbled forwards. I gripped trunks as I walked by them, steadying myself as I tripped with each step. After several painful minutes of staggering through the forest, I stopped again. I knew that at this rate, it'd take me years to get anywhere. This was going to be a long night. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.